Chapter 7. Firefighters. The boys started in fright. Had their escape already been discovered? "Lie down," hissed Tom. He had already dropped flat on his stomach. Carl and Bert followed his example. The man was almost across the square. They could hear him running. When he reached the tower door, they heard him fumble with the lock, and then the heavy door creaked open. Uncertain what to do, the boys continued to lie still for several seconds. They had to get off the roof as quickly as they could, but they were afraid to move because they might be seen. All at once, above them, the tower bell started booming. The man inside the tower was pulling the rope, sounding the alarm. The ringing of the bell spurred the boys into action. They couldn't stay where they were. They had to leave right now. They rose and hurried to the edge of the roof. There was the chestnut tree, but in the dark, it was much too dangerous to go down that way. "The roof isn't so terribly high," whispered Tom. "If we lower ourselves from the edge, our feet will be less than 2 meters from the ground. That's not much of a drop." He looked around for a place to jump off, but suddenly he noticed yellow flames shooting up from the roof on the edge of the village. "Look! A house is on fire! That's why they're ringing the bell, not because we've escaped!" cried Tom. In the darkness, they also saw the dark shapes hurrying across the square in the direction of the burning house. The ringing of the bell drowned out every other sound, but they could faintly hear voices shouting excitedly. "So they don't know we're out," said Bert, "and now that there's a fire, no one will pay any attention to us. It will help us." He carefully lowered himself from the edge of the roof, dangled by his hands for a second, and then landed with a dull thud. "I'm okay," he called softly. "Come on, it's easy." Tom and Carl also lowered themselves off the roof. They had no sooner landed when Scout came bounding out of the darkness. The rain had almost stopped. The boys began to cross the square in the direction of the main street leading out of town. But people came hurrying from all sides, heading in the opposite direction, toward the fire. The bell in the tower was still sounding the alarm, and the whole village was responding. "We'd better go in the same direction as everyone else," said Carl, "or else we'll attract attention." The others agreed, so they turned around and joined the crowd hurrying in the direction of the burning farmhouse. They soon found themselves in a narrow, winding street crowded with people, and they had no choice but to move with the flow. From there they turned onto a wide country road, but deep drainage ditches bordered the road on both sides. They still couldn't leave the crowd. "Just keep walking along," Tom whispered to his friends. "We'll get a chance to slip away a little farther on." The people were watching the flames leaping from the roof of the farmhouse and paid no attention to the boys. Ahead was the driveway leading to the farm. On the road stood a policeman, but he wasn't the man who had arrested Carl and Bert. "Volunteers, this way!" he shouted. "Women and children, stay here! All men and boys this way to help fight the fire!" A large group of men and boys thronged up the driveway. The three fugitives found themselves in the middle and had to go along. They were on the farmyard before they realized what was happening. Sharp, acrid smoke blew in their faces, and they could already feel the heat of the fire. This way, form a chain!" one of the firefighters shouted. The fire engine had not yet arrived, but there was a deep well not far from the house, and a long row of men were handing pails of water down the line and tossing them on the fire. It wasn't doing much good, however. The newcomers formed a second chain, drawing their water from the drainage ditch that ran past the farm. Tom and his friends soon found themselves handing pails of water down the row. It was heavy work, and sweat poured down their faces. More and more men arrived, however, and after a while they were relieved by new volunteers. About that time, the fire engine also arrived. Hoses were rolled out, and the commotion around the firehouse doubled. "This is our chance to get away. They don't need our help anymore. Someone's going to recognize us soon," Bert whispered to his companions. To leave by the driveway was too dangerous. They decided to strike out across the field so they wouldn't be seen. Tom called Scout, and gradually they retreated between the rushing firemen until they reached the rear of the farmyard. Now they were behind most of the people. "They'll never save that house," remarked Bert as they passed the barn some 50 meters from the house. The barn was dark and quiet. The wind was blowing the other way, so it wasn't in any danger. Besides, the cows were out to pasture. Then Tom heard rattling and stamping inside the barn. He shrugged and kept walking. But Scout blocked his way, whimpering and acting strangely. He acted very agitated. He ran from the boys to the door of the barn and then back again, barking excitedly. Something must be wrong, Tom said. They walked to the door, and when Carl opened it, a suffocating cloud of smoke belched out of the barn. Shocked, they drew back. The next moment, they saw flames shoot up in the back of the barn. Now that the door was open, the fire had more oxygen and flared up. By the light of the flames, the boys could quickly see what had happened. The lightning had also hit the barn. One of the horses had been killed, and a pile of hay had started burning. 3 horses tied in their stalls were foaming at the mouth in terror as they kicked and reared, trying to break loose. Hurry! Shouted Bert. Let's turn them loose before they burn. Carl, you could tell the fire chief. Followed closely by Tom, Bert dashed into the barn while Carl ran back to the house. The flames were now spurting up. The heat prickled their faces, and dense smoke stung their eyes and throats. Bert, a farm boy, fearlessly leaped between 2 of the rearing horses. Tom hesitated a moment. He wasn't as sure of himself. Overcoming his fear, however, he approached the 3rd horse. It wasn't easy to untie the terrified animals, for they kept tossing their heads. The 2 boys labored, sweating from the heat and fear. They began coughing and gasping for air. Every minute seemed like an hour. Finally, Bert had one of them untied. The horse reared up, pivoted on its hind legs, then tore out of the door like a tornado. A few moments later, the second one followed. Tom was still struggling with the 3rd horse. He couldn't get the knot loose. The blood rushed to his head, and he felt as if he was suffocating. In a daze, he saw Bert stagger toward him and free the fear-crazed horse with a few quick, deft movements. Tom started toward the door after the escaping horse, but he fell to his knees, coughing. Bert tried to help him up, but he was too groggy himself. Suddenly, Scout was beside them. He took the back of Tom's shirt in his teeth and began to pull. Bert helped him, and together they pulled Tom toward the door. When they had almost reached it, a powerful stream of water came shooting into the barn. The firemen had quickly run a hose to the barn and were ready to fight the new fire. The cold water hit Tom and cleared his head. Recovering his legs, he staggered through the door into the fresh air. Thanks for the help, he said to Bert, who still had his arm around Tom's shoulders. Boy, you're handy with those knots. I couldn't even get one of them untied. I was more of a bother than a help. Bert wasn't listening, however. He was looking about anxiously. I wonder where Carl went, he said. We have to get out of here. More men came running toward the barn, but Carl was not among them. Accompanied by Scout, Tom and Bert crossed the yard back to the house. Suddenly, Bert uttered a muffled cry and pointed. The policeman who had arrested them stood near the burning house. He was holding Carl. The man didn't seem to know what to do with his prisoner. He couldn't leave the scene of the fire, and he stood there looking around, perhaps expecting to see the other boys. The boys cautiously stalked the policeman and his prisoner, careful not to let the man see them. When they were close, Tom whistled the signal that they often used, and Carl at once looked in their direction. Relief was written all over his face when he caught sight of his 2 friends and Scout. Apparently, he had been afraid that they had been trapped in the burning barn. The crowd was now surging toward the barn as flames began to leap from it. Pulling Carl along by the collar, the policeman headed for the crowd to keep them from getting too close. In his haste, however, he tripped over one of the fire hoses. To keep from falling, he released his grip on Carl just for an instant that Carl made good use of. He fled toward his friends. Seeing him coming, they also broke into a run. The officer quickly recovered his balance, however, and he took off after them with a shout. But the boys already had a good lead, and there was so much shouting and confusion at the fire that no one paid attention to the policeman. Suddenly, the ground in front of the runners gave way to a wide, water-filled ditch. They had no time to change direction, however. Their pursuer was too close. "Jump!" screamed Tom. He followed his own advice, putting every last ounce of his energy into a leap across the dark barrier. He didn't quite reach the other side, but landed on the bottom of the steep bank, up to his knees in water. His friends had landed on either side of him. Scout was the only one to clear the ditch completely. Frantically, the boys scrambled up the bank and ran farther into the darkness. Not until they were 100 meters farther did they risk looking back. The policeman had apparently been stopped by the ditch. No one was chasing them. They were safe for the time being. They stopped a moment to rest, panting from the hard run, but they couldn't stop long. Looking around in the darkness, Tom saw that the clouds had disappeared and the stars were out. By the stars, he could figure out which way they had to go to reach the lake. This way, he told his friends. We better keep moving. When daylight comes, they'll be looking for us. Side by side, they hurried across the fields, moving as swiftly as the darkness and the terrain allowed. They were all tired and hungry, as well as wet. Tom still had some sandwiches, and he shared with his two friends. Scout, too, got a few crusts. The sandwiches weren't very fresh, but they tasted good anyway. As they walked, they discussed what had happened during the past day. Carl told them what had happened after he had run for help. He had warned the fire chief, and two men had come running back with him while others began rolling out a hose. As he dashed back across the yard, he had run right into the policeman, who had immediately recognized him. Amazed, the man had asked him how he had escaped from the tower, but Carl had refused to tell him anything. They came to another ditch, but this one wasn't as wide as the first. Jumping it quite easily, they crossed another pasture. Then they climbed a fence and skirted a huge grain field. Finally, they reached a road. Far behind them, they saw the red glow of the burning farmhouse, but the flames seemed to be dying. They made better time on the road. Cars with bright, glaring headlights passed them several times, but they had plenty of time to conceal themselves in bushes beside the road. They were sure they hadn't been seen.